Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Samantha Kilgore, and I'll be your host for this NASA Technology Transfer Program webinar on doing business with NASA through partnerships. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Mr. Joe Kroner, the Director for NASA's Partnership Office. Mr. Kroner began his career in 1990 as a procurement intern at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. He went on to serve in several other capacities at Goddard and headquarters, including Senior Contracting Officer and Procurement Manager at Goddard, Executive Officer and Director of Procurement Audits for NASA's Office of Inspector General, and Senior Analyst with the NASA Headquarters Office of Program and Institutional Integration. In November of 2014, Mr. Kroner assumed his current role as the Director of NASA's Partnership Office. In that capacity, he provides agency-wide policy and procedural guidance, operational support, advocacy, and training for NASA's domestic unclassified partnerships function. He also provides advisory and analytical decision support to NASA's Acquisition Strategy Council. Finally, Mr. Kroner facilitates the formulation and management of NASA's diverse partnerships portfolio, which includes over 2,000 active domestic unclassified partnership agreements across all NASA centers. Such partnerships are instrumental in supporting NASA's aeronautics, human exploration, space, and space technology missions, as well as other important agency objectives such as STEM education and public engagement. Mr. Kroner has a Bachelor's of Science in Finance from the University of Baltimore and an MBA from Loyola College in Maryland. Following Mr. Kroner's presentation on NASA partnerships, there will be ample time for Q&A. So before we get started, I'd like to point out that your microphones will be muted throughout this presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the main chat box located in the lower right corner of your screen, and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. My name is Joe Kroner. I'm Director of NASA's Partnership Office, and I'm very thankful to have an opportunity to speak with you all today about NASA partnerships. Next slide, please, Samantha. Okay, so what I'm going to cover in today's briefing is talk a little bit about NASA partnerships, the what, why, and when of partnerships. I'll also briefly provide an overview of NASA's partnerships portfolio in terms of the types of partnerships and the numbers of partnerships in which NASA is engaged. I'll talk about some key takeaways about partnerships and then leave you with some other information resources about how to do business with partnerships and where to find additional information. So before I get to that, just wanted to provide a little bit of information about my office, the Partnership Office. As Samantha said, the Partnership Office is essentially the policy office for domestic unclassified agreements. So I will primarily be talking about domestic agreements. NASA also does quite a few international agreements, which I'll talk about at a high level, but we have a separate office, the Office of International and Interagency Relations, which is the primary office of responsibility for international agreements. So I'll be speaking about that further. But I did want to make the distinction about the two offices and explain how the role and responsibilities are split between the Partnership Office on the domestic side and our Office of International and Interagency Relations on the international side. And before I get into those specific topics, though, as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I'd like to play a bit of a video that illustrates NASA's diverse partnerships portfolio. Okay, thank you, Samantha, for playing that. And while you're pulling the presentation slides back up, I'm going to start talking a little more about just what partnerships are. What do we mean by NASA partnerships? So in a broad sense, NASA engages in many different types of activities. We interface with a lot of external entities, with contractors that are providing goods and services to the agency. We partner with constituents and stakeholders across many organizations, including in the White House, in Congress, all of our scientific community, with the general public. So in a broad sense, all of those activities are considered partnerships because NASA could not complete its missions without the engagements of all of those external entities. But for the purposes of this briefing, we're going to focus on a very specific type of partnerships, and that's non-procurement partnerships, such as NASA Space Act agreements. So a Space Act agreement is a specific type of partnership, and we call it a Space Act agreement because we use the authority of the Space Act, which is the piece of legislation, the piece of law that gives NASA its authority for everything that it does. There's a particular section of the Space Act that's called Other Transactions Authority. So it says that in addition to providing the administrator of NASA with the authority to buy goods and services on behalf of the agency, NASA can conduct other transactions. And we use that authority to do things like reimbursable and non-reimbursable partnership agreements with different entities. And I'm going to talk more about what those means momentarily. So a Space Act agreements are NASA's predominant type of partnership agreement. So they are the most common, but not the only type of partnership agreement and not the only legal authority upon which NASA relies to do such activities. So we also use the Economy Act with other federal partners. We use the Commercial Space Launch Act with certain US commercial entities. We rely on the Federal Technology Transfer Act for many types of partnership agreements and many other less frequently used type legal authorities. Next slide, please. So in terms of the types of partnerships NASA does under these agreements, these non-procurement agreements, there are predominantly two types. We do reimbursable agreements in which the partner reimburses NASA in full or in part for access to unique NASA resources. The word unique there is very important because there are restrictions that prohibit NASA from competing with the private sector. So if there is something that a partner needs that's reasonably available through the private sector, that they can go out and buy it from a US company, then they have to do that. NASA cannot provide that service on a reimbursable basis. But NASA has many unique one-of-a-kind type resources that often benefit our partners, and we can make those available under our various legal authorities under partnership agreements. We also do non-reimbursable or no exchange of funds type agreements, and those are primarily used for collaborative activities where NASA may want to work with a partner or partners to help advance an area of interest to both parties. So NASA may have, for example, an interest in advancing a certain technology, a certain type of propulsion fuel, for example, and we may work with one or more external partners to help develop those fuels. NASA has an interest for its mission applications. The partner has an interest, a commercial interest in that. So we're able to work together often to jointly develop technologies. And under those collaborations, it's also important to point out that NASA understands that proprietary information and IP rights are critical for our partners. So we're very careful. Partnering with NASA for technology development does not mean that you lose your rights to your intellectual property. So there are very careful restrictions about how NASA can use the resultant technology under those collaborations. Of course, since we're a co-participant, we would have government purpose use for that, but we're not going to go out and put a partner's proprietary information out in the public domain, for example. I know that's that from previous questions, that's something that's always of concern. So I wanted to put that right out there. Less commonly used, we have two other types of partnership agreements that can be done under the authorities that I mentioned earlier. And those are called funded and unfunded partnerships. So these two types of agreements can only be used when NASA's procurement authority or other types of partnerships cannot be used. So a funded agreement is where we will actually announce an opportunity where NASA has a vested interest in advancing a certain area of technology for the public good, not necessarily for NASA's specific mission needs, but for the public good to help advance an area that's important. And it will announce an opportunity for proposals and provide funding to the selected partner. And the idea is that we're trying to spur innovation. We're trying to spur external development of an area that has not had a commercial interest up to that point. So it's seed money essentially. An unfunded partnership is similar, except that instead of providing funding money, we're providing non-monetary resources, and that could be a certain amount of access to NASA facilities, certain test time using test equipment. It could be access to other NASA expertise, such as consultation, or any number of other resources that are non-monetary in nature. Both of those categories, the funded and unfunded, are also required to be competed. So when there's an opportunity for resources to be provided in that regard, without a significant NASA involvement in a collaboration, they're always announced and competed. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, Space Act agreements and other types of partnership agreements are not procurement instruments. So they're not an alternative to the FAR requirements for going out and contracting when NASA has a requirement for a good or service. If there's a good or service needed for the direct benefit of the agency, we have to procure it through FAR procedures. And there are laws for that, including the Childs Act, which specify the types of things you have to procure versus when you can use the other transactions and other partnership authorities. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, why does NASA engage in partnerships? So primarily it's because partnerships are an essential tool for accomplishing the agency's missions. And there are several and very important benefits to NASA. They facilitate collaborative opportunities with both domestic and international partners. They help resolve gaps in technical capabilities that NASA needs. They support U.S. economic innovation and industrial competitiveness, which is another important goal of the agency. They serve as a tool for meeting NASA's mandate under the Space Act to provide the fullest commercial use of space and to transfer NASA-developed technologies to the U.S. private sector. They also help maintain underutilized NASA expertise and facilities, that there may be a gap in our mission needs for specific expertise and capabilities that we can help fill through making those resources available to external partners. And finally, they facilitate NASA STEM and public engagement goals. Also, it's important to point out that in regard to maintaining expertise and facilities, it's not just ground-based facilities that we're referring to in expertise, but partnerships have been brought to bear to help facilitate the Spacecom network as well as the ISS. So they also apply to space-based resources as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked a little bit about why NASA partners and what's in it for us. So the question is, what's in it for the partner? Why do partners want to come and partner with NASA? So we talked about a few of these in passing earlier, but one of the big benefits is access to unique NASA assets. We have a lot of specialized equipment that's world-class, one-of-a-kind type equipment that we can make available to partners without the partner having to incur a large capital expenditure. So it's an opportunity to leverage resources. We also have access not just to facilities and equipment, but to technical expertise. We have a specialized consulting and analyses. We have NASA developed software and other licensing opportunities that we could bring to bear under partnerships. We have a commercial leverage resources by co-funding technology development while retaining commercial IP rights to partner developed technology. So I mentioned that earlier. NASA is very sensitive to the fact that IP is the lifeblood of startups, and through partnering, you're not placing that at risk. So that's a very important point. And finally, partnerships with NASA bring to bear NASA's worldwide brand recognition. So I have to say that with a caveat that NASA does not endorse commercial products or services, even those of a partner that we're collaborating with. So When NASA's partnering with you, you can say, we're partnering with NASA on this, but NASA cannot say, buy that product or service from that company because we're partnering and theirs is the best. So there are some distinctions there in terms of restrictions with co-branding type considerations. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and I do realize I'm going through this kind of quickly. We will have some time at the end to talk about this further and have some Q&A. And even after this discussion, I will provide my contact information, and we're always more than happy to follow up and answer any additional questions you may have or point you in the right direction if you need some additional resources. So Sean, I know that this slide will look familiar to you because we borrowed this from Sean's office, the Technology Transfer Office. And I really like this slide. I decided to incorporate it in this presentation because it spells out kind of the life cycle from low TRL type activities to high TRL type activities, and provides some really good examples of NASA programs and tools that are available to support technology innovation throughout that life cycle. And the main takeaway I wanted to mention here is that partnerships can and do occur throughout all phases of the technology innovation cycle. So you don't have to wait until you have developed something to a very high TRL level. We do a lot of low TRL technology development partnerships as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to give everyone kind of a very brief overview. We've got many stats on NASA partnerships that can be overwhelming, but this is a very basic chart that gives you an idea of how NASA's partnerships portfolio looks like. So NASA partners with a variety of organizations, both domestic and international, as we mentioned, including companies, local, state, federal, and international government agencies, research institutions, public engagement organizations such as museums, colleges and universities, and many other types of organizations. So currently, NASA has almost 3,000 active, meaning unexpired, partnership agreements underway. And you can see from the pie chart there how those break down with by partner segment. So clearly, the U.S. private sector is NASA's largest partner by number of agreements, accounting for more than a third of our total number of partnership agreements. In terms of annual number of agreements, NASA enters into about 600 to 800 new domestic and international partnership agreements each year. So the agency is very active in partnering and interested in doing even more partnering. Next slide, please. Okay, so what drives NASA partnerships with NASA? One of the things we were interested in finding out is, we get a lot of contacts from folks wanting to partner with NASA, and we wanted to get some data about what are the primary areas where we are doing our partnering. And we did about 600 domestic agreements that were signed in FY20. So this does exclude international agreements. This is just domestic for this particular slide. And the two primary areas are research, technology development, and tech transfer, and engineering and test services. So those two categories combined, as you can see from the pie chart, account for about 64% of the partnerships agreements signed during the last fiscal year. Next slide, please. Okay, so you saw in the video many examples of creative NASA partnerships. A couple recent examples we wanted to point out is this one happens to be in the area of aeronautics. And you don't necessarily think about aeronautics when you think about Uber. That's one of the things I found particularly interesting about this example. But we are working with Uber in regard to urban air mobility and to come up with technologies and approaches for managing the nation's ever increasing air traffic. So, we have a lot more than just airplanes and helicopters flying around now. We have a lot of drones. There are flying cars in development. So NASA is very concerned, since aeronautics is the first A in NASA, very concerned about managing airspace. And this activity is one of several that are in place aimed at doing that. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to also give some examples of some commercial and international partnerships that will play a key role in achieving a sustainable and robust presence on the moon while preparing to conduct a historic mission to Mars. So there are already many partnerships underway aimed at NASA's missions to the moon, Mars, and beyond. And these are some examples. I'm not going to go into all of these. You're welcome to read those. There are more on our external NASA partnerships website that I'll point you to shortly. One that I did want to mention is the one in the lower left-hand corner. So hopefully many of you have had an opportunity to view the spectacular launch on Sunday, SpaceX's second successful crewed launch heading to the International Space Station. So that's quite an accomplishment. And that's one of the examples here. And we'll talk a little bit more about some other examples. Next slide, please. Okay, here's some additional examples. Again, I'm not going to go into all of these, but they're all very interesting in their own right and all critical for the agency. The one in the middle, for example, is Adam Johnson. That's for testing hardware in support of NASA's Artemis program, which is aiming to put the first woman and the next man on the moon by 2024. So that's a critical NASA program for obvious reasons. And also I wanted to mention NASA recently celebrated another very important historical anniversary. So many of you are, I'm sure, aware of this, but on November 2nd, NASA celebrated the 20th anniversary of the ISS. So that's 20 years of continuous human presence in space. And I was thinking about that, and I was actually talking to my kids about the launch. I have 18-year-old twins, and we watched the launch together, which was a great experience, and we talked about that. And it occurred to me that they have never lived a day where we didn't have a presence in space. So that's pretty fascinating that's the case for those of us that are a little older than 20 and realize how much work and effort it took to get to that point. So that's a magnificent accomplishment. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some key takeaways, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. I'm going to also talk about some resources momentarily. Some key takeaways that are important. NASA partnerships are ever evolving and continuing to diversify, right? So the partnerships that we do today are much different than what we did a decade ago. And there are many reasons for that. There are budgetary reasons, there are technological reasons, lots of drivers for that being the case. So NASA's partnerships today are opening access to low Earth orbit, access to the International Space Station, for more and more people. So we're looking to make space available, not just to NASA astronauts, but to private citizens eventually. And there are real examples of that are happening today. We are doing private astronaut missions, for example, that we have had private companies contract through SpaceX to provide private astronaut mission participants to the International Space Station to do experiments and for other commercial purposes. That's a very different environment and quite an evolution in NASA's partnerships. And NASA is certainly planning and working to do much more of that. There are also other types of low Earth orbit commercialization activities underway utilizing space station and other resources. Second point, external partners and their capabilities are expanding. The partners continue to make breakthroughs in exploration technology and science in areas pertinent to NASA's missions. And again, I'll point back to SpaceX since it's a very recent example. They are doing things that are evolving spaceflight. The technology that they developed to recover their booster rockets, right? They used to come down in the old days and they'd splash into the ocean and that would be it. SpaceX has developed a technology, and I'm sure all of you have seen the amazing videos where they've come down and they had some setbacks initially, figured it out, and now they are able to retrieve the booster rockets. They come down with retro rockets. They slowly hit the target on a drone barge that's out in the middle of the ocean, sail them back to port, get them ready for the next mission. So that's an incredible evolution in capability. So our partners are significantly advancing spaceflight capabilities for the nation. So that's very important to point out. And not just SpaceX. I know I've cited them a couple of times because of the recent successes, very high profile and impressive stuff. there are many companies that are doing the same thing with breakthroughs and innovation that NASA is relying on to help us meet our mission requirements. In addition, there are other commercial crew programs. So there are other companies, for example, that are working and very close to also being able to provide commercial crew services to NASA and to help commercialize low Earth orbit. And finally, effective partnerships with all partner segments will be vital for successfully accomplishing not only Artemis, but all of NASA's missions. And game-changing innovation is often occurs by small startups, academia, little labs. Those are the entities that are often making a breakthrough. So NASA is not just interested in partnering with the big aerospace companies, the traditional partners, who will continue to play an important role, of course, but we also want to tap into that innovation that's happening at other kind of non-traditional partner segments. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and this is my next to last slide, and this is just a screenshot of our external website. So if you have an opportunity, we strongly encourage you to check this out. It's got a lot of good information there. One of the things that we have on there is the section right in the upper left, how to partner with NASA. So that will provide some information. If you are interested in partnering with the agency and just not sure how to get started, one of the goals of this website and a lot of the resources that are available through this website were developed to help you navigate the bureaucracy, right? And take some of the mystery out of the process about how to get started. You don't necessarily need to know someone on the inside. We want to make sure that everybody has, that the process is transparent and that everybody has an opportunity to be considered for a NASA partnership. So in addition to that section, I'm going to go clockwise. There's a very important section, partnering events and opportunities. So that's where we post if there are announcements that are on beta.sam.gov, the federal site for posting business opportunities with the government. We will link to those through that section of the website. So you can click, there are some there now, and you don't have to click on it now, Samantha, but if you clicked on that, there are already some active postings that are there. We continue to keep that updated with new partnership opportunities. There, on the right, there are recent partnership examples, including some of those that I mentioned in the course of this presentation. There are others that are equally as important and interesting as well. So I would encourage you to check that out when you get a chance. In the middle with the map of the nation. So that map identifies all the locations of NASA facilities. And it also provides the primary partnering contacts for each of those facilities. So for example, if you knew that Johnson Space Center had a capability that you were interested in working with them on, we would have the information to the partnership offices at Johnson. You can click on that, as well as all the other centers. So it will provide a summary of the primary capability areas at each of those organizations, each of those NASA centers and facilities with the centers, component facilities of those centers, like White Sands Test Facility, Wallops Flight Facility, the integration, validation, and verification facility, and points of contact that you can reach within each of those organizations. We have a frequently asked questions site down there with a question mark that you can go in and get answers to common questions about partnerships. And finally, the current Space Act agreements. We have a listing with copies of all of NASA's active Space Act agreements that are publicly posted. You can go in and take a look at that and see what a partnership agreement looks like, and see the terms and conditions that are in there. So for both reimbursable and non-reimbursable agreements. So that's pretty much it in terms of resources. Next slide, please. Again, we would strongly encourage you to check out the website when you get a chance. And we don't want this to be just a one-time dialogue. So if you have follow-up questions that we don't get to, we still have plenty of time for questions and answers. And I'm happy to answer as many of those as I can before 2 o'clock. If I don't get to your question, or if you have a question that you didn't think of that you want to follow up later in a week or in weeks to come, please feel free to contact me, and we'll make sure that we get answers to you, and we'll do our very best to steer you in the right direction. And that's all I've got in terms of prepared presentation, but I am more than glad to answer any questions anyone may have.